atheists and creationists are both religious. Whether you are an atheist or a creationist, you have the same problem, the existence of existence, the prime reality problem, the initial cause of everything. What is the self-existent reason for everything? What is the ground of all being? No human being on the face of the earth completely understands such questions, let alone a possible answer. It is an imponderable mystery, of which we try to ponder regardless, because of our inherent curiosity, and there is a religious component to the whole thing, no matter which worldview you might have. And some people remain undecided. I have always been agnostic with certain issues. The creationists claimed that it all began more organized and complex. The atheists claimed that it all began simple, and, gradually, over a very long time, became more organized and complex. And at first glance both propositions seemed reasonable. But, if looking at this whole business like a scientist, then, I have to base ideas, primarily, more on what is known, than what is not known, for science is the discipline of distinguishing the known from the unknown by the use of experiment and observation. Given what humanity now scientifically understands about the fine-tuning of things, what has been revealed after much rigorous investigation in so many ways and in so many places, the likelihood of God's not existing appears so highly improbable, that I would not base my life decisions upon atheism, although I know, even now, some people still choose to do so, perhaps along with the multiverse religiosity. But not me, and my reasons are inductive. If absolute certainty is not achievable when trying to estimate the probability of God's existence, then some people feel that it would still be rational to play the apparent odds and at least, as atheist Richard Dawkins says, take the position of being a cultural Christian if not a believer, even when one might think there still appears to be some room for doubt. However, I, unlike Dawkins, would not be doing it only out of utility, but also out of a sense of where more of the scientific evidence is pointing, where the observable natural processes are heading. Nevertheless, with the various people who claim to follow Christianity, it might still be prudent to acknowledge the good fruitage, along with the bad, even if there is skepticism about the existence of the tree, or from which tree the different fruits came. But what if I choose to try and test somehow the axiom of biblical inerrancy, the internal self-consistency of biblical canon, the notion that the Bible is the inspired word of God? Well, if humans really are in a fallen state according to biblical definition, then a significant portion of such people, who still embrace atheism as a basis for their life decisions, while perhaps claiming they are moral, I predict, will still embrace Darwinian ideology, taking shortcuts, jumping queues, cheating if they imagine that it can be done with impunity, lying, even if only sometimes where it might be possible to get away with it, some of them murdering, many of them engaging in hedonistic pursuits even to the harm of others, and egotistical in their desire to outcompete others and elevate themselves, and thus demonstrate their insecure and imperfect condition, and make manifest the rotten fruitage of such an ideology. This is not to say that all atheists are deliberately bad people, nor that all religious people are good either, but certainly all people are imperfect, and not all people are trying hard to be good, but instead many enjoy the badness, and embrace it, nor do all define good and evil on the same basis. How in everyday life one could always successfully navigate their way through such a wilderness of moral relativism is difficult to understand. Perhaps there are people who delude themselves into believing that they can always do it. Some atheists claim that their position is not religious, only a position of disbelief. This kind of wordplay can be easily refuted. For instance, some say that the existence of God requires an explanation in its own right, because, according to the second law of thermodynamics, the creator would have to be more complex than the creation itself. And this is where some atheists contradict themselves when using this argument. They appeal to their own belief system. They want to believe that there has to be some way that simplicity can naturally evolve into organized complexity, even though the argument for the uphill evolution dogma is self-defeated already from the first argument, when they are appealing to the second law, which is most decidedly downhill. Thus, inadvertently perhaps, the logical conclusion remains that the creator has to be more complex than the creation, and so the atheist's argument for belief in uphill evolution is manifestly a self-contradiction when demanding a naturalistic explanation for God, and flies in the face of all experiment and observation, thus revealing the fuzzy concept of unguided, uphill evolution to be an outright superstition. In a closed system, entropy only increases, and other than the apparent neutral mutations, science only knows of the random degenerative mutations that are there for nature to select, and, for all intents and purposes, the universe is a closed system. Therefore, according to even the most atheistic physicists, its heat death will ensue if left to run its course. But, despite this, due to fanciful imagination and wishful thinking, the abiogenesis myth, and the macroevolution hypothesis, perpetuates. Why do such experimentally disagreeable beliefs still persist among many atheists? Appealing to lots of time, as an attempt to support the uphill evolution belief system, does not in itself rescue that superstition but only makes it worse, when acknowledging experiment and physical reality, especially the statistical principles underpinning all decay processes. If all natural evolutionary processes only result in accumulating disorganization, then the primed mover has to be the most complex entity that ever existed, self-existent, not created, something for which the known natural laws do not apply, something supernatural, outside of nature, that cannot be investigated completely by science. They say that God requires a scientific explanation in his own right, which, for mere humans to say, sounds arrogant. But science cannot sufficiently prove nor investigate the supernatural. So they refuse to accept the biblical explanation. Scientism is the naturalistic religion of many modern-day atheists. So both belief systems are not experimentally reproducible, neither divine creation of life nor uphill evolution. That which is reproducible, and reliably so, is downhill evolution, thus leaving us with the inescapable question of its more ordered origin, a question that atheists seem to hate. It's very emotional. They prefer to engage in argument by exclusion, when dismissing the idea of a more complex origin, and mostly only allow the idea of a simple one, no matter how much the consistently observable processes of nature point the other way, because that is the only naturalistic way of trying to save their paradigm. However, ultimately, I can't provide absolute proof of God's existence, not with 100% certainty. I can only appeal to a preponderance of corroborating evidence, which looks overwhelming. But for some people this will be insufficient, and maybe that's the point. Perhaps we have been left in the dark somewhat, just to show us how lost we ultimately are, without a supreme being to guide and help us. Humanism seems to fail in this regard. But whatever the case, we should be humbled because of this problem. It should ultimately make us question, what kind of universe are we living in, naturalistic or theistic? What is the Bible about? Does such an ancient text hold any relevance for us today, in this more scientifically enlightened era? the Bible? Well, it's about a lot of things, of course. How everything came to exist, where things went wrong, and how God will fix it. And all these prophecies are connected to God's Son Jesus as the Savior of mankind. The means by which God Jehovah will save humanity, so we are told. It's hard to talk about it in only 5 minutes. When someone asks that question, what is the Bible about? Perhaps they really want to know if it is relevant to them. Is it worth the time looking into? Or is it true? Is it really the Word of God? How do we test these claims? We know that it's a collection of little books. It began to be written in 1530 BCE, and was completed over 1,600 years. In the Bible, God introduces himself by his name, Jehovah. Psalms 83:18 says that for people to truly prosper, they need to know that Jehovah alone is the Most High over all the earth. So, the Bible starts by giving us its explanation for why the universe exists, how, and why we exist, that it was all intelligently created by Almighty God, not just by some unguided natural evolutionary process, not by a series of super unlikely happy accidents, that some people today seem to believe in. And that being said, there are still many scientists today who do think that some kind of intelligent design is a rational explanation, because of the order, the complexity, the critical specifications of various things, including the finely tuned laws of nature, that allow you and me to exist as the biological entities that we are. But people inevitably ask, why would God allow evil and suffering? Well, the Bible explains how God has been misrepresented. And it explains that this misrepresentation has a lot to do with why the suffering exists. And it shows how God will restore his reputation, and that part of God's purpose for the earth is to eliminate suffering from humankind in the future. For now, many people agree that the Bible provides us with practical wisdom and knowledge to help us cope with problems. For instance, many today are familiar with what is commonly known as the Golden Rule, to treat others as you yourself would want to be treated. And that's just some of the things that Jesus taught. Another example is how to cope with anxiety. To live one day at a time. And not worry about what may or may not happen in the future. Jesus advises us that each day has enough of its own troubles. Very wise words. The Bible offers advice on how to have a happy marriage. It tells us, each one of you must love his wife as he does himself. On the other hand, the wife should have deep respect for her husband. Ephesians 5:33. Various studies have demonstrated that human beings are imperfect and tend to forget a lot of these things, so we need reminding. And the Bible encourages us to regularly look into the scriptures, so that we are, in effect, helped by God. Archaeology provides much confirmation of biblical history. Even for some of the most ardent skeptics of religious dogma, who might view scripture to be of human origin only, even many of them recognize that even though there are no original writings known, there are numerous ancient copies of scripture that have been found, some dating back to very early times, copied by professional scribes, cross-checked and verified, spurious texts and apocryphal writings eliminated, and the original meaning of it has been handed down, well preserved for us today. And this achievement is from one of the most exhaustive and longest-running scientifically rigorous restoration processes of all time. Even when such people choose to simply view it as an ancient historical artifact, there is no credible basis for denying the accurate quality of the preservation of its original message, and its original meaning. But, of course, if the Bible is the Word of God, and has his backing, then, from a Christian worldview, this is exactly what we would expect to see. It's one of the oldest writings, and is recognized as the most widely published and translated, and well-preserved, books of all time. It is estimated that over 5 to 7 billion copies have been printed. So, this is not an argument from personal incredulity, or some kind of blind faith. This is evidence-based. There are numerous lines of evidence. It's always good to remember that. We can, at least, conclude that all these things are consistent with what the Bible itself claims to be the inspired Word of God, a canonical, internally consistent set of writings from 40 different writers, and its claim that God put His thoughts into their minds for us to read. Yes, that is what the Bible itself claims. So, what is the Bible about? Right from the older Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures through to the later Greek writings, it's about the sanctification of God's name, it's about eternal hope for humans, and the means by which such a hope is possible, through the price paid by the Son of God, Jesus Christ, and by God's kingdom, and evidently backed up by certain lines of evidence, and various messianic prophecies. We are told that within its pages are wisdom and knowledge from the Creator of the universe, Almighty God, Jehovah. How does that stack up against the opposite position of denial and skepticism via atheism and materialist ideology? If we had no skin in the game here, unconcerned about death and the duration of our own existence, if that were actually possible for a human, and we could be agnostic in the most idealistic sense, unemotional, and purely logical, if that was somehow possible for a sentient, flexibly abstract, forward-thinking creature like us, where would the total evidence available tend to point us? Without God in your worldview, what do you have to work with? Is there anything tenable? Can the known natural evolutionary forces, alone, account for all existence? Where do we look, how do we look, to answer this question? Natural processes. When atheists are referring to unguided natural processes to explain all creation, the unfounded assumption by them is that nature itself is not intelligently created, but just exists for some other unexplained reason, for they would say that a supernatural creator would also require an explanation. So when looking at the specified natural laws of physics, atheists want to assume that these laws were not intelligently created, they just somehow emerged from simplicity, which is an extraordinary metaphysical claim which contradicts all uniform experiences of nature, when the second law of thermodynamics says that, when only blind natural processes are involved, organized complexity decays into chaotic simplicity, which is the total opposite of what they want to believe, and therefore seems like they are suppressing a truth that was already clear to them, that the overwhelming appearance of design is vastly more likely to be evidence of an intelligent creator. To try and claim, let alone prove, a negative, in this regard seems far more superstitious. So why would God not just manifest Himself with a supernatural sign of some sort? Should we expect a sign? This is sometimes referred to as divine hiddenness. Are there already signs perhaps that have been missed by people? Has the evidence for an intelligent creation been overlooked? Is the evidence inexcusable, like the Bible tells us, after all? What about all these so-called anthropic coincidences that physicists are talking about? Everything about nature seems to fit perfectly together for humans to exist. Is it really gradualistically bottom-up, or is it intelligently top-down design? Should we dogmatically dismiss the entropy problem as non-applicable, in this regard? Can humans ever solve this mystery on their own? Is there anything remotely experimentally accessible before 10 to the minus 43 seconds after the so-called Big Bang, to explain the required highly specified initial conditions of such a mysterious singularity, for our current existence to now be possible? Isn't it strange, how when deeper science digs, and the further down we go, the more specified and finely tuned things seemingly always have to be. If we choose to ignore the uniformitarian principle of historical science, we might fancifully hypothesize that the natural laws of the past were different than the present. We might speculate that entropy was able to reverse, as a just-so story of creation, but this would be equivalent of appealing to miracles, a vast multitude of them, an overwhelmingly improbable series of super-unlikely happy accidents, yet we know from experience that the vast majority of accidents are anything but happy, to say the least. Carbon-based life is the only life we know of in the physical world. The fine-tuning in the laws of nature have to be so precise for carbon atoms to form, which makes an intelligent designer, God, seem overwhelmingly plausible. And this is but one of numerous other precisely specified laws that are necessary for our existence. How did all those highly specified natural parameters come to exist? Not by chance. So some atheists claim the existence of an infinite number of other universes all having different laws, to try and make chance the possible explanation for our universe, but all they have done is kicked the can down the road, because the multiverse also requires an explanation for how it could exist, but even if it did exist, that still doesn't resolve the entropy problem for the existence of highly specified, irreducibly functional life. Raw energy cannot create life, and for energy to be of any use, the mechanisms of life have to be already in place to harness it, otherwise chaos ensues. Belief basis. Scientists know that there are many things that all need to be in just the right place, for the most minimal life known to be possible. The most minimal life that we know of has staggering complexity. How did all those necessary things come to be specifically fitting together, all at once? Could it ever have been by some yet unknown unguided evolutionary processes? How did such irreducible functionalities originate? By chance, or planned design? What do you think? What do you prefer to believe? And why do you prefer that axiom? But is basing that decision upon what you prefer wise? Should you not instead base it upon your repeatable observations of the world? Top-down faith. Atheism forces some people to reconsider more carefully the reasons for their belief in the existence of God. Some, who had a top-down faith, have been prompted to agnostically deconstruct their faith in God's existence, and rebuild it from the ground up. The honest agnostics are currently engaging in this process. There are two types of agnostics in the world though. One is, not knowing but wanting to know, and the other type does not want to know. If someone prefers willful ignorance, then that's not a good way of approaching life's problems. Disbelief in the existence of God despite the overwhelming evidence for intelligent design, is, for some people, a form of sulking. Things have not gone right in my life, therefore I will blame God for it. Or I will just say that God doesn't exist. One is bad-tempered out of annoyance or disappointment, waving their fist at the sky. Such morose withdrawal from the logical inferences for God's existence might be derived from setbacks, bad decisions that a person has made in their life along with all the deleterious consequences. Perhaps it's due to the hypocrisy of religious people and maybe we can't blame them for at least that. Perhaps a friend of a certain religious persuasion has let us down, or maybe it's due to various types of personal failure, or it might simply be due to the unfortunate unforeseen accidents of life, but in this respect it's likely that you are no different from anyone else. Another possible reason is that it is simply inconvenient to a person's lifestyle. They might wallow in self-pity, annoyed at anyone with a different point of view on their life situation. This is by no means an exhaustive list nor in itself an argument, either for or against God's existence, for that's not the point. When one sometimes observes the vitriolic ranting of atheists against an entity that they claim does not exist, it is telling, there is no logical consistency to it. If God doesn't exist, and it's just natural processes to blame, then why not be angry at those, instead of the personal entity that you claim to be fictitious? Okay, natural processes are not personal, instead they are blind, pitiless, and indifferent to your concerns, and it's of little use getting cranky at them. They don't care about you at all. Physical processes don't care about your feelings, and perhaps you wonder if this God that you claim only others believe in might also be that way, but how can you ever be sure? And if you are not sure, then why the ranting in the first place? Is it just some form of therapy on your part? Is there anything more to it than just mere emotional venting? You might be your own worst enemy. Ignorance might be blissful in the short term, but where is it going to get you in the long run? Is it ultimately going to help you, or harm you? If God exists, there are profound implications for our own existence, and if God doesn't exist, there are also profound ramifications. You either want to know, or you don't. It's probably one of three things. You are either hopefully curious, apathetic, or bitterly resentful of your situation. And, for all of us, these are pretty tough questions that need to be asked for our personal growth. Ignoring experimental science. The famous atheist Richard Dawkins insisted that to understand complexity you need to understand simplicity. In that simple statement, he has manifestly ignored experimental science. And he completely ignores the second law of thermodynamics. All life requires specified information, programming. It requires a choreography of continual multiple decision-making events. Information processing and decision-making is inherent to all life, and such programming doesn't originate through randomness, and certainly not from simplicity. How anyone can believe that life could ever spontaneously arise by chance is astounding, especially from someone who claims to promote science and rational thinking. How can such a person believe such a thing when science has revealed unfathomable levels of specificity and irreducibly functional complexity, even in the simplest of the self-replicating life forms known to science? I assume that Dawkins would be aware of these things, given his field of endeavor. His self-replicating molecule hypothesis is just desperate wishful thinking, and a complete superstition, so much worse than any of his derogatory sky daddy characterizations of the people who believe in intelligent creation. Naturalism does not explain it at all, because no one has ever observed nature doing that. If nature is ruled out, then we are either left with nothing, or a supernatural creator. Our minds cannot comprehend a self-existent creator, but that in itself doesn't prove it wrong, especially when the physical evidence points in the direction of an organized beginning. Where did all the complexity ultimately originate? So how can something as complex as an intelligent creator, God, arise from nothing? Well, that is a question that cannot be answered by mere humans, and the premise of the question itself could be wrong. By its own definition, a self-existent entity, if existing, would not have to spontaneously arise. Logically, there had to be some kind of an initial self-existent cause for the universe, even though it seems impossible for us to explain how that might be. How can God be self-existent, and how, and why, is there something rather than nothing? Why is there such a thing called existence? How existence exists is imponderable. Is it possible for there to be absolute nothing? We might assume, but surely, from nothing, nothing comes. So therefore there must have always been something, because we are now observing existence, itself, existing. The real question, that we have at least some chance of being able to answer, is whether that first self-existent cause was complex, intelligent, or whether it was simple and mindless. Either hypothesis cannot be completely understood. Either idea cannot be given a sufficiently complete explanation. To think otherwise would be outright hubris. The question that can be reasonably asked is, which belief bodes well with observable processes of nature? Where are the consistently repeatable processes of nature pointing us? Within nature, we only see that complexity decays into simplicity, and that seems to point us back to a more complex, more ordered, beginning. And when you logically extrapolate it all the way back to the beginning of the various life forms, and then even further all the way back to the beginning of the universe, ultimately you are forced to consider the possibility of something from outside of nature, something supernatural that is not subject to the natural law of decay, something self-existent. If intellectually honest, the error is in thinking that this evidence, alone, is always enough to give you sufficient faith in God's existence. Other lines of evidence need to be investigated as well, if getting closer to truth is your goal. The archaeological evidence in support of biblical accounts, for example, Bible prophecies, the marvelous creation around us, and the many intricate designs, the anthropic fine-tuning of our cosmos, the irreducible complex functionalities found in life. The theistic, biblical, explanation for the problem of evil, is important. If you don't take these things seriously, you will miss out on a great deal of important information, and your worldview will remain narrow, and you will likely continue to live your life according to how it might seem to you, a pointless, temporary and ultimately futile, brief, existence. Maybe there is nothing left but pure nihilism and despair. You may put it off in your mind for a while and live in denial, but it is inevitable that you will be forced to face it sooner or later, and the longer you leave it, the more unprepared for it you will be. While on the subject of biblical prophecies, I feel it appropriate to give a particular one an honorable mention, a prophecy found at 2 Timothy regarding the last days, where it points out the bad personality traits that many people will have during the time of the end, a prediction that many people will not be open to any reason. So it doesn't matter how reasonable you are to such ones, it won't matter how overwhelming the evidence that there is to support a certain case, it will make no difference to such people, and that illustrates why all forms of human rulership appear to be ultimately futile. Baiting and switching thermodynamic laws. Some evolutionists express doubt about the specificity of the genetic code embedded on DNA being comparable to the specificity of computer code, or indeed any other claimed type of specified biological information existing, and if it is at all comparable with other forms of specified complexity or symbolically encoded information, and therefore they dispute whether biological information would degrade before what they want to believe might happen, before new added novel biological information and organized complexity might somehow accidentally arise by unguided evolution. And that is their worldview, their belief system. It is amazing that they would not instead doubt the complete opposite of that, given the consistently observed processes of nature, especially if they are truly scientific. However, this notion, by evolutionists, of at least partial non-specificity, if not total, is a speculation to accommodate their ideology of exclusive naturalism, to support atheism and humanism, despite the fact that it violates every experience of nature ever observed by scientists or anyone else, namely that entropy increases, things decay, that this is the uniform experience of all scientists in the laboratory and in the field. Why they insist on believing or speculating such an unproven opposite exception, namely some fancifully imagined naturalistic uphill evolution, despite the uniformly opposite experience of everyone, you would have to ask them, but if intellectually honest one would have to acknowledge that the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that natural evolutionary processes are only ultimately destructive, and there is no definitive observation that would suggest anything different with how Darwinian processes affect genetic codes and biological systems in this regard, namely, it is highly likely that successive generations of biological forms always naturally degrade over time too, as has often been observed by population geneticists, and this is also the only direction of change observed in the universe with everything else. So, once again, the burden of proof rests with the Darwinists and atheists, whereas creationists, of whatever kind, have nothing in this particular instance to defend themselves from. It has already been scientifically defended and proven beyond all reasonable doubt that everything in the universe is on a one-way, naturally irreversible, downward spiral of decay and increasing disorganization, toward gene death, and toward heat death, toward simplicity. Atheists don't like this, because then they are confronted with the question of the fine-tuning of things, and how it all began more ordered. The scientific evidence inevitably points to intelligent design as the best explanation. Also, you might have noticed that this is a purely scientific question, a problem that natural science alone cannot answer. I can imagine an atheist or evolutionist hearing this, what I just said, right now, getting outraged, the veins on their forehead swelling. They will angrily express how I misapplied the word entropy. They'll give me some convoluted argument about open and closed systems. And, by the way, their argument in this regard is nonsense. Either cunningly or stupidly, they constantly bait and switch you between the first law and the second law of thermodynamics, between the loss of available energy and the conservation of energy in an open system, without telling you, but instead pretending that it's some kind of reverse entropy, which is absolute nonsense. And so many gullible people get fooled by this deceptive trick, but there are plenty of smarter people out there who can see right through it. They are just trying to redefine things to fit their own narrative, and therefore, a pointless argument, a waste of time. The only good reason to spend time arguing with such people, is to help the less knowledgeable of this, and the innocent onlookers, so that they might become more aware of this crooked deception, so that they are not also taken along, and misled, by such an invalid conflation. So you see, that is the materialist atheist worldview, which requires them to engage in this kind of wordplay, and thus we sometimes observe the attempted hijacking of scientific terminology by such people. Since worldviews are being discussed, we are told in the Bible of a garbage dump outside the city of Jerusalem, known as Gehenna, that Jesus used as an analogy, to symbolize permanent destruction. From a Judeo-Christian perspective, one might make a comparison and infer that it was for very similar reasons that Jesus disputed specific issues with the Pharisees, that it was mostly for the benefit of those who were listening, those who could potentially be misled by the falsehood of the Pharisees, but that the honest-hearted among them might see the truth through it all, and not become twice as much a subject for Gehenna, total annihilation, than what the Pharisees themselves were already becoming. That is, not to become permanently non-existent, forgotten by God and therefore no hope of a future resurrection. I'm not sure what category the atheists fall into in this regard, maybe not as reprehensible as the Pharisees and Judas Iscariot, I might imagine. Who knows? Not me. Only God can read a person's heart. We are told that He compassionately remembers that we are dust, and living in very dark times indeed, right now, and does not want anyone to be destroyed, but for all to repent and get everlasting life. Biblical accounts seem to reveal that His mercy is far more profound than perhaps what our feeble minds can imagine. The anthropic cosmos. How did the universe get to be anthropic, able to allow human life to exist somewhere in it? Anthropic fine-tuning is the fact that our universe has the right parameters to allow the possibility of the existence of humans. The fundamental laws and constants have the precise values required for our existence. The fact that these parameters exist is not in dispute, but there is disagreement among different people as to why these exact parameters exist. If the anthropic principle provides a plausible explanation for the fine-tuning of our universe, in a hypothetical multiverse the typical universes are not fine-tuned for life, but if there are enough other universes existing, a small fraction will be capable of supporting intelligent life. Others argue that the universe is fine-tuned for discoverability, and that such fine-tuning cannot be explained by the multiverse hypothesis. The universe's laws, fundamental parameters, and initial conditions, must be just right for the universe to be as discoverable as ours. The weak anthropic principle just states that we have to be in a universe that supports us, observers. While obviously true, it doesn't answer why that is so. The anthropic principle can often be misleading. It is often criticized as a cop-out because it suggests that the universe must be the way it is for us to observe it, without offering deeper explanations. Also, the anthropic principle is often criticized for lacking falsifiability, and therefore its critics may point out that it is a non-scientific concept. The strong anthropic principle states that the parameters of the universe must be such that the known life forms, including conscious observers, are possible. It goes against the so-called Copernican principle, which says that we are not special, but instead that the universe was actually designed for the existence of intelligent beings like us, let alone whether or not it intelligently came to be that way. Regardless of who agrees or disagrees about it, scientists refer to the anthropically fine-tuned laws of physics as fundamental. The laws and constants are classified as fundamental, because they cannot as yet be derived from anything else. There is currently no deeper scientific explanation for them, and so their precise values are a complete scientific mystery. Instead of the atheistic bottom-up approach, we might instead come at it from a theological top-down approach, and state that if we take human life as our target condition of the universe, then we may use this as the starting point to derive expected properties of the universe as being consistent with the conditions that will somewhere permit human life to exist. The late Stephen Hawking pondered this problem. The fine-tuning revolves around the observation that the fundamental physical constants and laws of the universe are set in such a precise way that they allow for the existence of life. If those constants were even slightly different, it seems that life as we know it would not be possible. Atheists and materialists often object to the fine-tuning argument. They say that the evidence of fine-tuning will somehow be explained, and they don't like how the fine-tuning design argument for God is presented. They say that the fine-tuning can be hypothetically explained in terms of the existence of multiple universes, the multiverse, and the operation of the anthropic principle. But it is often argued that the use of data from contemporary physics can be evidence for God's existence, that in the absence of any divine intervention, there was very little chance that a universe like ours would come into existence. Materialists posit that our universe is not finely tuned for life, but it is barely compatible with life as we know it. And any universe with randomly chosen combinations of fundamental parameters will also almost always be barely compatible. The anthropic principle says that if the universe has those properties which allow life, intelligent, to develop within it at some stage in its history, then one of the following must be true: there exists one possible universe designed with the goal of generating and sustaining observers, a theological universe. Or the universe somehow arose from blind random processes, perhaps from multiple universes, an infinitely large cosmic lottery, providing endless multiple chances for it to arise with all the necessary physical parameters required for intelligent life. So how is our universe so remarkably well suited for life, to a degree unlikely to happen by mere chance? It is typically argued that the universe must therefore be the product of intelligent design. The expansion rate of our universe matches up with the total energy density, what seems to be an impossible coincidence. Therefore atoms could form, planets, stars, and galaxies could form. And the universe has the right amount of smoothness, 1 part in 100,000. At its birth, it neither expanded too quickly nor collapsed. This perfect balance seems to cosmologists like an extremely unlikely coincidence. And this is one of many unlikely details in the anthropic fine-tuning of the physical cosmos: the speed of light, the gravitational constant, the electromagnetic force, the strong and weak nuclear forces, all perfectly balanced against each other, fitting together in such a way as to allow an anthropic cosmos to exist. Therefore, the mysterious singularity, this initial condition, from which the universe is believed to have expanded, had to have been fine-tuned to an incomprehensible degree of precision. Cosmologist Sir Roger Penrose calculated it to be 1 in 10, to the power 10, to the power 123. It may be impossible for this quantity to be represented by a singular number, for the amount of zeros in that number might be similar to, perhaps even more than, the amount of fundamental subatomic particles in the observable universe, let alone the parameter space that this denominator is attempting to describe. If we just look at the gravitational constant on its own, it is calculated by physicists to have a precision of at least 1 in 10 to the power 40. And that's a conservative estimate. That's a 1 over a singular number with a 1 followed by 40 zeros. Just imagine, you have a tape measure of 1-inch increments, and the total length of it was spanning the entire visible universe. Only one of those incomprehensibly numerous inches would be within the life-permitting range. That's right, only 1 inch. If you went 1 inch to the left, the universe would expand too rapidly and dissipate, and if you went 1 inch to the right, the universe would collapse. Can you even comprehend such vast, virtually infinitesimal precision? To the human mind, it's unfathomable. Faith and science. It has been said, faith is the process of removing doubt. Science is the process of requiring doubt. Ironically, it is impossible to remove all uncertainty in science, for it is provisional, nor can this be said of faith either. Science is always skeptical and challenging. Science and faith can live together, but, if we remove doubt from science, it becomes religion. For instance, the term, renewable energy, is manifestly a myth. Much of what makes this so-called renewable energy function comes from the Earth, so it's a shell game. It constantly is running out and needs to be replaced, and, even if you recycle the materials, there will always be some kind of carbon footprint from it. That doesn't in itself necessarily mean that it's a bad thing if taken on in balance. But what about the good side to faith? In the biblical book of Hebrews 11:6, it says, "Whoever approaches God must believe that He is and that He becomes the rewarder of those earnestly seeking Him." Did you notice the fundamental prerequisite there? First, we fundamentally need to believe that He is. We need to believe in the existence of God. How do we do that? Do we just blindly believe it? No. Of course not. Our belief needs to be based on the preponderance of evidence that exists, which is possible for us humans to know about, the facts. That which is observable. Science is the process of distinguishing the known from the unknown. It is also, through repeatable experiment and observation, about distinguishing what is fact and what is nonsense. Furthermore, it is about distinguishing what natural processes can do, and what natural processes cannot do, and this is what atheists and evolutionists sometimes tend to forget. Instead, they make the unsubstantiated metaphysical claim that God doesn't exist and that natural evolution somehow did it all, and so they irresponsibly tout it as a God substitute, and they have imposed this idea on the minds of impressionable young school children, often causing them to grow up with no lasting hope, which makes many of them eventually fall into nihilism and despair, antisocial behavior, depression, damaging forms of hedonistic pursuits, resulting in the harm of themselves and to others, and sometimes even suicide, more often than what one might imagine. And now the world is more godless than ever before. We may well reflect on all the monstrous dictators who have used Darwinism to justify their unprecedented genocidal atrocities on mankind. We may also reflect on the many religions who have claimed to be Christian but who in fact have misrepresented God and the Bible, thus confusing vast numbers of people into disbelief of God or the Bible, and logically would therefore be reprehensible in the eyes of God, deserving of an adverse judgment. So you owe it to yourself to take these things seriously. Don't be like those who are apathetic and indifferent, for in the long term it will not go well with such people. It never does. Develop far-sighted wisdom in your life. There is profound meaning for you to discover, if you so desire. It's totally up to you. Think about it. Many people have been tricked into thinking that the debate between creationists and evolutionists is only about science. But science is not the only thing that is at stake here. That's just a dogmatic viewpoint, because, from a strictly agnostic perspective, both sides of the argument have their own types of religiosities. The main cause of the argument, in the first place, is to do with origins, the origin of life, the origins of species, phyla, and different life forms, and the origin of the universe, fundamentally the origin of existence itself. What we really have here is two fundamentally different creation stories, two fundamentally different religions, that both claim to be supported by science. From there, many tend to discuss the ad hominem reason, on either side, for why they are believed, why some choose to believe there is no God, and others choose to believe that there is a God, an intelligent creator. The hardcore evolutionist will take the position that there is no need for a God to scientifically explain the existence of everything, whereas creationists, whether old Earth, old universe, young Earth, young universe, or simply neutral, intelligent design advocates, will say that a God is scientifically needed for an ultimate explanation of the physical world. Both evolutionists and creationists have to deal with the prime reality problem. Both sides of the argument cannot logically explain their own beliefs of whatever the necessary self-existent past eternal cause of everything might be. The evolutionist typically ends up imagining an infinite regressive cause and effect going back into the past, whereas the creationist has to posit an abstract but necessary, self-existent, intelligent being. In fact, at this point, it may be hubris to think that we humans could ever completely comprehend such a thing, whatever the prime cause of it all is. When we first look at naturalistic explanations of evolutionists, for a lot of it, it certainly seems that there are many authoritative reasons to think them true. However, when we dig deeper, the cracks start appearing. The insidious dogmatism of Darwinism. Let's do a search on Google about evolution theory, a typical search an average person might do, and ask a question like, is evolution a fact? And you might get the following answers. Yes, in the scientific context, evolution is considered a fact, meaning it's a widely observed and repeatedly confirmed phenomenon, not just a theory, with abundant evidence supporting the idea that organisms change over time. Okay. Is macroevolution considered a fact outside the scientific context? With this question, Google does not give you a direct answer, but gives you a list of secular and creationist websites. Well, at least that was my experience. I'm assuming it won't be the same for everyone, and, if so, this type of inconsistency is rather concerning. In fact, after repeating certain questions sometime later, things happen differently, so it's very unreliable and misleading, if you are not more careful. Anyway, this is just my initial experience with it, which is disturbing enough for the welfare of any novice. Well then, let's be more specific. Is macroevolution a fact? Answer: the fact that both micro and macroevolution, including common descent, are supported by overwhelming evidence remains uncontroversial within the scientific community. Well, Google didn't really answer the question here, It just said that the wide acceptance of the idea was a fact, which is questionable, to some degree. And what is this overwhelming evidence that they speak of? Let's ask another question about it. Is macroevolution a theory? The answer we got is, yes, macroevolution is a scientific theory that explains the large-scale evolutionary changes observed in the fossil record and in the diversity of life, building upon the same mechanisms of microevolution, mutation, migration, genetic drift, and natural selection, but at a larger time scale. Question: is macroevolution a hypothesis? Google's answer: while macroevolution itself isn't a hypothesis, it's the study of evolutionary changes above the species level, and specific macroevolutionary patterns and processes are often framed as hypotheses that can be tested using evidence from the fossil record, phylogenetics, and molecular biology. Has macroevolution been proven? Google's answer: yes, macroevolution, encompassing the large-scale evolutionary changes leading to the diversity of life, is widely accepted as a fact by the scientific community, supported by overwhelming evidence from the fossil record, comparative anatomy, and genetics. So Google says that it's been proven. But once again, no experimental evidence specifically for macroevolution is mentioned. Let's ask it a more specific question: has macroevolution been created in the laboratory? Answer: laboratory experiments can demonstrate evolutionary changes within species, microevolution. Creating macroevolution, evolution above the species level, in a lab setting, is challenging, due to the vast timescales and complex interactions involved, though some experiments have shown changes that approach the fringe of macroevolution. So, Google admits that it is challenging, and the idea relies on vast timescales, which are of course unobservable. When asked, has macroevolution been demonstrated experimentally? Google doesn't give us a direct answer but just gives us a list of sites. Question: is macroevolution falsifiable, or not? Google's answer: yes, macroevolution, like all scientific theories, is falsifiable, meaning it can be potentially proven wrong through observation and experimentation. Here's a more detailed explanation. What is falsifiability? In science, a theory is considered falsifiable if there's a possible observation or experiment that, if conducted, could demonstrate that the theory is incorrect. Macroevolution and falsifiability. Macroevolution: the large-scale evolutionary changes, supposedly, leading to the emergence of new species and higher taxonomic groups, is a scientific theory, and like all scientific theories, it is subject to falsification. Examples of falsification: while macroevolution is supported by a wealth of evidence, there are potential scenarios that could lead to its falsification. For example, if a new fossil discovery revealed a species that appeared suddenly in the fossil record without any transitional forms, or if genetic studies showed that species could not evolve beyond a certain point, it could challenge the theory of macroevolution. I must interject here, trying to get genetic studies to prove that species could not evolve beyond a certain point, this might not be a good scientific proposition, because you are trying to prove a negative. Something that in principle might be impossible to test, which is generally viewed in experimental science to be quite often unattainable, because of its open-endedness. That being said, there is strong evidence that suggests that certain species cannot evolve beyond a certain point. But absolute proof of that might not be possible. Google presents the question: why is falsifiability important? The ability to falsify a theory is a key characteristic of scientific theories. It allows scientists to refine and improve their understanding of the natural world by continually testing and revising their ideas in light of new evidence. Well then, in line with what Google stated, let's ask that specific question: is there a new fossil discovery that revealed a species that appeared suddenly in the fossil record? Answer: a recent fossil discovery revealed a species, Gang2 Cuneo aspera, that appeared suddenly in the fossil record, specifically during the Cambrian explosion, and possessed soft tissues, including a mouth fringed with tentacles, revealing it to be a cnidarian, related to modern jellyfish and anemones. Question for Google: does Gang 2 Cuneo falsify macroevolution? Google's answer reveals its limitations. It replied, "Your search, does Gang 2 Cuneo falsify macroevolution, did not match any documents." And then it presented suggestions: make sure that all words are spelled correctly. Try different keywords. Try more general keywords. Try fewer keywords. So let's talk about some of the evidences that many people today are not informed about, because so far in our searches Google has not done a very good job. There is existing overwhelming scientific evidence that shows the overall pattern in the fossil record is not consistent with what is predicted by macroevolutionary theory. There are examples of transitional fossils that are not nearly sufficient. Natural selection has critical limitations. Natural selection has no foreknowledge. And natural selection is limited by the percent of the population it can keep from reproducing. Deleterious mutations are much more common than beneficial mutations. And deleterious mutations overwhelm beneficial mutations. There is not enough time, for the number of mutations required, to ever evolve new physical features. There is no evidence of creation of genetic information. Microbiologists do not know yet if body plans can mutate successfully. There is no realistic proposed scenario for macroevolution. Realistic computer simulations demonstrate degradation, not uphill evolution. Many of these aforementioned points the mainstream will not talk about, or hand-wave off without definitive evidence. There are some ideologues who refuse to distinguish micro from macroevolution. Why this is so, one can speculate about. But, in science, distinctions are important, and have to be made. So then if we ask, have scientists witnessed increasing functional complexity with evolution experiments in the laboratory? And this question will most certainly lead you down a rabbit hole. Once again, there is no direct answer, but it did suggest different questions that people often ask. Such as, is evolution an increase in complexity over time? Answer: it is argued that complexity, rather than fitness or organization, is the quantity whose increase gives a direction to evolution. The increase in complexity is shown to be a consequence of the process by which a self-organizing system optimizes its organization with respect to a locally defined fitness potential. Once again we see Google quoting the beliefs of what evolutionists argue for, who state their beliefs dogmatically, as though they are stating facts, instead of what they really are, just speculations without definitive evidence. Notice their dogmatic speech, claiming that their idea has been shown, when in fact it hasn't literally been shown at all. Of course, when we are less specific with the question, as most people are likely to be, and just ask, has evolution been proven in a lab? When not specifying it as macroevolution, we unsurprisingly get the following type of answer: yes, evolution is proven beyond the slightest shadow of a doubt. In a research group, for example, we are studying a population of yeast, of the same species that makes bread and beer, wine, that was evolved in the lab to do something that the original population could not. How do scientists observe the process of evolution in the laboratory? Evolution may be observed in the laboratory as individuals. Populations adapt to new environmental conditions by natural selection. There are two different ways in which adaptation can arise in experimental evolution. One is via an individual organism gaining a novel beneficial mutation. Have we ever witnessed evolution? There are many other cases in which evolution has occurred on timescales that we can directly observe. These include squirrels, mosquitoes, and other organisms evolving in response to climate change. Fish evolving in response to pollutants. Does evolutionary change always lead to greater complexity? evolution does not always lead to more advanced species. Evolution is simply a description of the way change occurs in biological creatures over many generations in order to better exploit a certain environment. Evolution sometimes leads to progress, but it sometimes leads in the opposite direction. So say the evolutionists. It would have been more honest to say that no one has yet observed evolution leading to more advanced species, and more specifically define progress. Google's next point: what is the increasing complexity theory? Scientists and philosophers have long argued that many natural systems, and perhaps even the universe as a whole, possess an inbuilt tendency for complexity to increase with time. This claim, however, rests uncomfortably with the second law of thermodynamics, with its emphasis on the rise of entropy. Well, that's interesting. So I decided to go back to one of Google's earlier answers about the study of evolutionary changes above the species level, and ask, have scientists observed evolutionary changes above the species level? Google's answer just parrots off the old dogma without citing experimental proof, and says, yes, scientists have observed evolutionary changes above the species level, known as macroevolution, through the fossil record, comparative anatomy, and other evidence, demonstrating the emergence of new life forms and diversification of species. Here's a more detailed explanation: macroevolution versus microevolution. Evolutionary changes can be broadly categorized into microevolution, changes within a species, and macroevolution, changes above the species level. Evidence of macroevolution. Fossil record. The fossil record provides evidence of the emergence of new species, genera, families, and other groups of animals over geological time. Comparative anatomy. Examining the structure and function of different organisms, they say, can reveal shared ancestry and evolutionary relationships. Well, that might be true sometimes. Molecular biology, comparing DNA sequences across different species, they claim, can also reveal evolutionary relationships and changes. Examples of macroevolution: Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of many major animal groups in the fossil record during the Cambrian period, they assert, is a classic example of macroevolution. Well, that is puzzling, to claim it for a supposedly gradual evolutionary process. Sudden appearances of major animal groups is not what evolution would predict at all. That's not gradual, is it? Who are these people? Evolution of mammals. The theoretical assumption of diversification of mammals after the extinction of the dinosaurs is another, supposed, example of macroevolution. Evolution of body plans, presumed, changes, that were never observed happening, in the basic body plans of organisms, like, the posited, evolution of limbs or jaws, are, said to be by evolutionists, also examples of macroevolution. Well, did you notice, that all those examples given, were things that are claimed to have supposedly happened in the distant past, and so could not be directly observed happening? So, you can see that the question was not actually answered, because Google just quotes what other people are saying. It does not think for itself. All it really provided was confirmation bias for evolutionists and atheists. So if we ask the question more specifically, saying, have scientists been able to experimentally demonstrate evolutionary changes of increasing complexity above the species level in the laboratory? Well, once again, it could not give me a direct yes or no answer. It spewed out more rhetoric. The answer came up short, and repeated once again its dodgy answer, as though it were a cunning lawyer defending a dodgy conman in a court of law, and said, while laboratory experiments have demonstrated evolutionary changes, directly observing the evolution of increasing complexity above the species level, macroevolution, in a controlled environment, is challenging, due to the vast timescales involved. And then gave me more convoluted evasive language and said, here's a more detailed explanation. Challenges of studying macroevolution experimentally. Macroevolution, or evolution above the species level, encompasses processes like speciation and the emergence of new taxonomic categories. These processes typically take place over long periods, making them difficult to study directly in the laboratory. Once again, did you notice the dogmatism? They use the word typically. But how can they say it's typical when it hasn't been directly observed happening? Does this really show up as a pattern in the fossil record? Google's next point: focus on microevolution instead of directly observing macroevolution. Laboratory experiments often focus on microevolution, which is the study of evolutionary changes within a species or population. Examples of laboratory evolution experiments: long-term evolution experiment, LTEE. This experiment, led by Richard Lenski, has tracked the evolution of Escherichia coli, E. coli, over thousands of generations, demonstrating adaptation and divergence within a species. Snowflake, yeast, experiments with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, yeast, have shown the evolution of multicellularity, demonstrating changes in morphology and organization. Other organisms, studies have also been conducted on other organisms like Drosophila, fruit flies, bacteria, and yeast, revealing adaptations to new environments. Limitations: while these experiments provide valuable insights into evolutionary processes, they don't necessarily demonstrate the emergence of new species or higher-level taxonomic groups in the laboratory. Inferences from fossil and phylogenetic evidence. Understanding macroevolution often relies on inferences from fossil evidence, phylogenetic reconstructions, and extrapolations from microevolutionary patterns. If you try to pin Google down and ask, "Is it true to say that macroevolution has never been demonstrated via experimental means?" Google does not answer, it simply gives you a list of sites on the topic. Question: have scientists ever observed increasing complexity in the laboratory? Answer: and once again, no answer. Just to test Google a bit more, I reiterated one of its own statements in the form of a question and asked, have scientists ever been able to experimentally demonstrate the emergence of new species or higher-level taxonomic groups in the laboratory? And once again, no direct answer, just a list of different sites. Google just spews out the dogmatic statements of evolutionary theory, stating them as though it were proven. However, there is no experimental proof, but, as Google admitted, just extrapolation and inferences, without definitive experimental support for macroevolution. Only microevolution, and vast timescales is always the rescue device to excuse the lack of experimental evidence. This kind of language will fool many, and provide confirmation bias for many others. You need to have a sharp mind, and a hunger for the truth, to see past all the convoluted rhetoric, to see that evolutionary theory has its own philosophical and religious components. Okay, let's be more direct and ask, is there evidence against evolution? Google provided some common arguments against evolution which often focus on perceived gaps in the fossil record, the complexity of life, and the perceived lack of evidence for transitional forms, but then claims that these arguments are often based on misunderstandings of scientific evidence and processes. We are given a breakdown of some common arguments against evolution and why they are often considered scientifically weak. 1. Missing transitional forms in the fossil record. Argument: critics claim the fossil record lacks clear transitional forms, showing the gradual evolution of one species into another. Scientific response: the fossil record is incomplete, and finding every transitional form is unlikely. However, numerous fossils demonstrate evolutionary transitions between various groups, including fish and amphibians, reptiles and mammals, dinosaurs and birds, and whales and land mammals. Example: the fossil record shows a clear progression of whale evolution from land-dwelling ancestors to modern aquatic whales, with transitional forms exhibiting features of both. So this is the typical secular evolutionists' response to the objection, but many have now rebutted this response, saying that the fossil record now is complete enough to once again point out that there is a lack of transitional forms, because of the sheer amount of fossil specimens that have been catalogued. So, despite this, the gaps remain, which after many more years of fossil discovery and accumulation, is not what we would expect to see if macroevolution were a real process of nature. The gaps have not decreased like evolutionism would predict. 2. Irreducible complexity argument. Some argue that certain biological systems, like the bacterial flagellum, are irreducibly complex, meaning they cannot function if even one part is missing, implying they could not have evolved gradually. Scientific response. This argument, it is claimed, is based on a flawed understanding of evolution. Many complex systems can evolve in stages, hypothetically, with each step providing a selective advantage, even if the initial stages seem incomplete. In that statement, you may have noticed the complete absence of appeal to experiment and observation, which is a very low standard of evidence indeed. Example. Google touts the evolutionist dogma using a well-known example, the bacterial flagellum, while complex, can be broken down into simpler parts, each with a function, not mentioning that they can only function when all together, and then religiously says, and these parts can have evolved gradually through natural selection. So, once again, there is no appeal to experiment and observation, only an imaginative, possibly fictional, story is put forward. This objection fails to recognize the reality of it, which are the many parts that cannot function on their own. The statement omits that problem, and religiously views the difficulty through the lens of naturalism, thus it is an argument by exclusion. 3. Lack of evidence for evolution in the present argument. Critics argue that evolution doesn't happen fast enough for us to observe it, so it's not a real process. Scientific response. Evolution can occur at different rates, and we can observe evolutionary changes in some species, like bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics, or insects evolving resistance to pesticides. Example, the rapid evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria is a clear example of evolution happening in real time. Yes, but what category of evolution are we talking about here? It's rather sad how Google has given the public such an oversimplified view of the problem up front. With this type of search engine, it has not produced for us a truthful and accurate picture at all. It fails to distinguish that particular example as microevolution, and fails to point out that what has occurred, in these instances, is a loss of genetic information, due to mutations, even though it incurred a selective advantage on the organism, which is a very significant piece of information that would have been quite valuable and significant to a person asking the original question. 4. God in the gaps argument. Some argue that because we don't fully understand how life arose or how complex systems evolved, it must be the work of a supernatural being. Scientific response. This is a logical fallacy. The fact that we don't know something doesn't mean a supernatural explanation is required. Science continues to make progress in understanding complex biological processes, and we should not use ignorance as a justification for supernatural explanations. Well, does it follow then that we shouldn't use ignorance as justification for naturalistic arguments that cannot be proven experimentally? Because it seems that this is what they are hypocritically doing. They want to equivocate science with naturalism, instead of repeatable experiment and observation. Example, the development of complex biological systems, Google dogmatically asserts, can be explained by natural processes like mutation, natural selection, and random genetic drift. Once again, we are presented with a claim, but there is not any definitive experimental evidence presented here. 5. Entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. Argument. Some argue that the second law of thermodynamics, which states that systems tend towards disorder, contradicts evolution, which, supposedly, involves increasing complexity. Scientific response: the second law of thermodynamics applies to closed systems, but the Earth is an open system that receives energy from the Sun, allowing for the development of complex structures and organisms. Example: the naturalistic argument by exclusion quoted by Google is, the development of complex biological systems on Earth is driven by the flow of energy from the Sun, not by a violation of the second law of thermodynamics, so say the evolutionists. Well, if this is true, then has anyone ever directly seen, in a laboratory setting, the flow of energy from the Sun driving the complex development of biological systems so that they increase their complexity, even the tiniest incremental step genetically uphill? Here we have a disingenuous description, by evolutionists, by materialists, of entropy supposedly reversing in an open system, instead of properly identifying such a phenomenon for what it really is, conservation of energy, as physicists will point out. And we are given an insufficient explanation of how entropy works, equivocating raw energy with functional specified genetic information and specified complexity in biology, which is an utterly laughable and ridiculous explanation, that any physicist worth his salt would perhaps shoot down in flames, as would those who are experts in information theory. In conclusion, while there are valid criticisms of specific aspects of evolutionary theory, the overwhelming scientific evidence supports the theory of microevolution as a fundamental principle of biology. Certainly with many microevolutionary arguments that is true. The arguments against evolution are often based on misunderstandings of scientific principles and processes, or on a lack of understanding of the fossil record and other evidence, which, in some of those instances, may be true, but, for the most part, we were given, by Google upfront, a sloppy standard of evidence. How disappointing, and uninformative for the general public. This does not immediately give people the true picture at all, about the valid criticisms. Does entropy disprove macroevolution? Some have contended that the second law of thermodynamics disproves evolution because the law stipulates that entropy always increases, whereas evolution into complex beings constitutes a decrease in entropy. However, evolutionists explain that the second law applies only to systems with no external energy sources. People also ask, does entropy prove God? In religious thermodynamics, entropological proof or entropy proof of God's existence or entropic proof is an entropy-based argument for the existence of God. There is no scientifically certain proof that the end and the beginning of the world, and then the existence of God, can be derived from the entropy law. When we simply ask, does anything disprove evolution? Google's answer was rather bad. It said, evolution could be falsified by many conceivable lines of evidence, such as, the fossil record showing no change over time, confirmation that mutations are prevented from accumulating in a population, or observations of organisms being created supernaturally or spontaneously. This answer was so misguided and unsatisfactory, because, when it comes to the prevention of accumulating mutations as a requirement for refuting macroevolution, the opposite is true. Both, an evolutionist and a creationist, would always expect change over time, as we always see things in everyday life, but it would be a dispute about the direction of the change, in that things are either getting better or worse, not whether change happens, and, mutations accumulating over time, is not disputed by creationists at all, but when Google infers that it is, that's a blatant straw man argument. How disgraceful, when in fact, the rate of accumulations mutating, in itself, doesn't distinguish the truthfulness, or falsehood, of macroevolution, but clearly the real dispute that has been raised by creationists, is, whether mutations can make life better or worse. So, wherever it was that Google got its ridiculous answer from, whoever the idiot writer was, that Google was stupidly quoting, it clearly shows how flawed, and misleading, Google's search engine can be. The fact is, it is even more significant, that accumulating, deleterious, mutations, would, be expected, in populations, to refute macroevolution. And Google failed here to acknowledge a very salient and significant scientific distinction, that the vast majority of mutations are either non-selectable, or deleterious. As for requiring the observation of organisms being created supernaturally or spontaneously, this is not necessarily a requirement at all, and probably not within the reach of science. That's just somebody's oversimplistic view of things, for we can logically point out a similar problem for the macroevolution belief system, because it is part of a bigger creation story in itself, a naturalistic one, a story about what happened in the remote unobservable past. And macroevolution has been scientifically accused of disagreeing with experiments and repeatable observations. Can entropy ever reverse? While entropy naturally tends to increase in isolated or closed systems, it can decrease in open systems where energy and matter can be exchanged with the environment. However, any decrease in entropy within a system requires a compensating increase in entropy elsewhere, ensuring the overall increase in entropy remains true. This so-called decrease in entropy is actually an example of energy conservation. So merely characterizing it as a decrease in entropy is unsatisfactory. Let's ask Google, can entropy reverse, or only decrease? Here's a more detailed explanation, the second law of thermodynamics. This law dictates that in a closed system, entropy, a measure of disorder, tends to increase over time. Entropy and time's arrow. Some physicists believe the increase in entropy is what gives time its directionality, meaning that processes move forward rather than backward. Challenges to time travel. The second law of thermodynamics poses a significant challenge to the idea of time travel, as it would require a system to decrease entropy, which is generally considered impossible. Micro versus macro. While microscopic interactions can appear reversible, at the macroscopic level, the effects of increasing entropy become evident, making time appear to flow in one direction. Time travel in science fiction. Many films such as Tenet explore the concept of time travel and how entropy could be reversed in order for time travel to be possible. So, aside from the fanciful nonsense of science fiction, finally we get the true picture here. It is generally considered impossible for a closed system to decrease entropy. Microscopic interactions can appear reversible, but at the macroscopic level the effects of increasing entropy become evident. Google asks, what about reverse entropy, or the conservation of energy, in open systems? In the context of open systems and thermodynamics, while energy is conserved, entropy tends to increase, not decrease, meaning natural processes favor increasing disorder, not the opposite. Here's a breakdown of why. Conservation of energy. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed or transferred. In open systems, energy can flow in and out, but the total energy of the system and its surroundings remains constant. Second law of thermodynamics and entropy. The second law of thermodynamics introduces the concept of entropy, a measure of disorder, or randomness. This law states that in any natural process, the total entropy of a system and its surroundings always increases or remains constant in a reversible process, meaning natural processes tend towards greater disorder. Entropy in open systems. While energy is conserved in open systems, the tendency towards increased entropy still holds true. Open systems can exchange both energy and matter with their surroundings, and this exchange can lead to an increase in the overall entropy of the system and its environment. Negentropy, or reverse entropy. The term reverse entropy is sometimes used to describe the opposite of the natural trend of increased entropy, or the process by which systems become more ordered. However, the natural processes in the universe tend towards the increase of entropy, and reverse entropy is not a term that is usually used in scientific literature, as the second law of thermodynamics dictates that entropy always increases or remains constant in a reversible process. Examples: one example of an open system is a living organism, which is highly organized and can appear to fight entropy, but this is only possible because they obtain and use energy from their surroundings, which in turn increases the entropy of that environment. As Britannica states, in the case of the spontaneous condensation of steam into water, although the entropy of water is less than that of steam, the process occurs spontaneously because of the decrease in temperature, which offsets the entropy change. So, now we are getting to the bottom of things. There is no atom for atom reversal, but merely a conservation of energy. Finally, Google said something more accurate: microscopic interactions can appear reversible, but at the macroscopic level the effects of increasing entropy become evident. So, when someone is labeling the change in an open system as negentropy, or reverse entropy, what they should be describing it as instead is the conservation of energy, not reverse entropy. That term is confusing and insufficient. But the evolutionists sometimes like to use it, because obviously it fits into their narrative. They believe that it somehow fits into their imaginative story of increasing complexity. But as we have seen, this terminology ultimately lacks meaning, and that is why physicists generally don't use it, because it's not needed, and just unnecessarily makes an already difficult concept even more confusing. So in some sense it's not parsimonious, and neither specific nor comprehensive enough. One gets the impression that some evolutionists are trying to use this bad argument, which sometimes relies on these bad terminologies, to somehow support macroevolution, when it clearly cannot, because it doesn't address how the mutation selection mechanism can explain the origin of genetic code and molecular machines, not just with the first minimal replicating life, but also theoretically they cannot create a statistical logical pathway, using what we already know about genetic information and mutations, to ever substantiate macroevolution, their proposal of naturally caused ascension of all subsequent life. It seems that they cannot even make a clear case why life instead should not just be degenerating. So, people have theoretically imagined unlikely scenarios where entropy might naturally decrease or even fundamentally reverse, but it has never been observed. The best you can hope for is a conservation of energy happening, which some people define as localized decreases in entropy within open systems, and then evolutionists might sometimes infer that this somehow relates to a hypothetical naturalistic increase of biological complexity from evolutionary processes. And some people might use the term negentropy, or reverse entropy. But this is just wordplay, and a technically insufficient description. Physicists generally don't use such terms because they unnecessarily make the entropy concept needlessly more confusing. Conservation of energy is the clear distinction, to avoid confusion. But, if you choose to go with the wildly imagined actual entropy decrease from particle reversal, ever happening at a more fundamental level, as if in a movie film running in reverse, certainly, theoretically, this ludicrous improbability might logically sound possible if the observable universe possessed infinite time and infinite space, from which anything could happen, Boltzmann brains included, but that's not the universe we are living in. So, in the real universe, in cases where the level of complexity is above a certain threshold, and a very low one at that, it follows that in those circumstances, the combinatorial possibility space, or vastly larger yet again configurational possibility space, both vastly exceed what the universe can make available for the natural change to ever go in the opposite of the normal direction, which, as we all experience, is toward more disorder and randomness. The opposite of that looks virtually impossible. The observable universe is neither big enough, nor old enough, to ever contain the probabilistic resources required to allow such a highly unlikely reversal event to happen. And yet perhaps in a similar way, some people might imagine that functional complexity can somehow increase in biology for natural selection to then grab hold of, so that the macroevolutionary interpretation of the fossil record might be justified. But, it appears that this is not possible for similar reasons, because entropy doesn't decrease in a closed system, and can never reverse at the fundamental particle level, like a reversing movie, nor totally at the DNA code level, whether a system is open or closed. That would constitute a miracle. Since science is now uncovering the specified functional complexity of genetic code embedded on DNA molecules within all organisms, no one has yet provided a comprehensive naturalistic explanation of how the genetic codes and the intrinsically related molecular machinery or mechanisms, even in the most minimal life known, could have all originally come together to form a highly sophisticated, functional, and self-replicating unit, like a prokaryotic cell. Nor has any scientist been able to provide an experimental demonstration of increasing complexity from only natural processes like mutation and selection. Ironically, they have been able to demonstrate decreasing complexity. What might that tell you? So it seems that there is no tenable naturalism of the gaps argument that can be made here to adequately account for the irreducible functionality of a prokaryotic cell, let alone the higher forms of life. No atheist nor evolutionist has ever been able to provide a complete computational logical pathway to get around this problem naturalistically from the ground up, not even just a minuscule segment of uphill movement. Some may hope that in the future they will somehow provide a naturalistic explanation from the ground up, and if some people want to believe that it one day might happen, well, good for them, but of course many deep-thinking people unsurprisingly don't. Due to this understanding of things, the intelligent design hypothesis might appear more plausible. Unless somebody can come up with a better explanation. We haven't seen it yet, and it looks doubtful that anyone ever will. But who knows? Perhaps I'm wrong. You decide. Old versus young worldviews. The debate over whether the Earth is young or old is a disagreement about the age of the Earth and the universe. Whatever the case, if the universe, at bottom, is theistic, then this would be a very different type of universe than just a universe that formed out of only unplanned natural processes, and, whatever the case, designed or not, the implications are profound, in one way or the other. Young Earth creationism is the belief that the Earth and life were created by God in 6 days, about 6,000 years ago. Young Earth creationists have promoted creation science as a basis for their belief. Some say that this young Earth belief contradicts scientific evidence that the Earth is about 4.54 billion years old. Inerrancy is the idea that something is without error or fault. It can also refer to the belief that the Bible is free of error. The Hebrew word yom can be translated as day in English, but it can also refer to other time periods. The exact meaning of yom depends on the context. So, it would be pointless to fall into the trap of cherry-picking words and phrases from the Bible while ignoring the overall context of the biblical passage under consideration, as some people unfortunately tend to do, for whatever reason. If we take the internal logical consistency of biblical canon seriously as our axiom, then context is very important. It must not be ignored. Even if it leads us to a conclusion that we dislike, we must follow the evidence wherever it leads. Old Earth creationism is the belief that the Earth and universe are much older than 6,000 years, and that creation happened over billions of years. Some say that old Earth creationism is more compatible with scientific consensus on the age of the Earth. Both views are based on the idea that the Bible is ultimately from God, and historically accurate, and that it is supported by prophecy, archaeological science, geology, physics, astronomy and so forth. Regardless of secular or theologically based ideology, as with all scientific disciplines, people of all viewpoints in this case are also, in principle, forced to acknowledge that everything began in a low entropy state. This seems to be in some sense about as fundamental as the speed of light. Of this, there is virtually unanimous scientific consensus, regardless of the otherwise vast and diverse disagreements thereof. Some old Earth creationists believe in theistic evolution. It is the belief that the scientific principles of evolution, the Big Bang, and the age of the Earth are compatible with the metaphorical interpretation of the Genesis creation account. There are different versions of old Earth creationism, and many believe in intelligent design theory, which holds that a higher power guided the creation process. Regardless of all the subtleties, the difference between the two particular worldviews essentially stems from their different interpretations of the early chapters of Genesis. It is often pointed out that the young Earth belief conflicts with the age of 4.54 billion years, measured using independently cross-validated geochronological methods, including radiometric dating. But, young Earth creationists hold to the view that the origin of the Earth, the universe, and various forms of life etc., are all instances of special creation. The idea of special creation involves direct divine intervention, where the laws of nature are suspended to achieve the creation process. Yet others have a philosophical problem with God breaking his own laws in this regard, but, to counter that line of reasoning, it is suggested that certain types of laws do not apply to God, but only physical things, therefore it does not violate God's perfect integrity. For example, there were laws written for the ancient Israelites that no longer apply to Christians, because they were written to accomplish a specific purpose at a specific time period, and thus in a similar way miracles do not violate God's goodness. And so some believe in young Earth creationism, which states that the universe was created in 6 literal days about 6,000 years ago. Other Christians believe in different versions of old Earth creationism, which states that the universe is much older than that, and creation happened over billions of years. How old is the world according to the Bible? It has been said that the Bible does not necessarily require us to think of the earth as 6,000 years old. It can be computed from the genealogical lists in Genesis that the human race is about 6,000 years old, but many interpret the rest of creation to be much older. According to Jesus, Noah, the ark, and a global flood that killed all the birds, beasts, and people on the earth, all were as historically real as his second coming. Old Earth creationists contend that God miraculously created the universe from nothing, ex nihilo, created life from non-life, and progressively intervened in history to supernaturally create new species of life, and therefore, in this view, the age of the Earth has no bearing on the creation of life. Both views allow for the idea that dinosaurs were created by God on day 6 of creation, however long you interpret those days to be, along with humans who it seems were the last creations of God, Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 to 27, and so some believe that dinosaurs and humans coexisted and co-inhabited the earth. Also see Job chapter 40, verse 13, chapter 41. Verse 34, if true, then the majority of dinosaurs might have died when God flooded the world, Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, chapter 8, verse 19, while the rest died out sometime after the flood. According to Big Bang cosmology and the second law of thermodynamics, when it comes to the length of time that life can exist in the universe, as a fraction of the theoretically derived lifespan of the universe, as measured from its calculated beginning to the extrapolated evaporation of the last black hole, life as we know it looks only possible for 1,000th of a billion billion billionth, billion billion billionth, billion billion billionth of a percent. So, due to entropy, it seems that without divine intervention from God, periodically replacing the old with the new, like someone replaces an old worn-out garment, then the heavens will pass away into cold nothingness, a heat death. In the comparatively shorter term, theoretically, certain effects will counterbalance the impact of mass loss by the Sun, and the Sun will likely engulf Earth in about 7.59 billion years from now, when the Sun becomes a red giant, as how other similar stars typically seem to age and die, according to astronomical observations. The biblical view, however, is that the earth will remain forever and God will sustain the universe. As far as the debate about old Earth and young Earth, many remain agnostic, because some feel that it may be very hard for science alone to empirically definitively distinguish between the correctness of either argument. If God created things instantly, already looking old, then how would you scientifically prove that? It seems, you cannot. Some philosophically feel that because God would not deceive us into thinking something that is not true, therefore the earth and universe look old because they are. The day-age view of creation is a theological interpretation that suggests the days described in the Genesis creation story are not literal 24-hour periods, but rather represent vast stretches of time, potentially from thousands to millions of years each, allowing for a reconciliation between the biblical account and scientific evidence about the Earth's age. Day-age creationism proclaims that the 6 days referred to in the Genesis account of creation are from thousands to billions of years. And some feel that because such an omnipotent and powerful God, who while creating the rest of the entire universe, would not have been constrained to literal 24-hour Earth days, neither would he have had to constrain himself to literal Earth days while creating life on Earth either. But who are we to tell God what to do, or how he should have done it? That seems rather arrogant, does it not? However, the biblical view is that God's seventh day of rest is not a literal 24-hour day. God's day of rest was still happening in the time of the Apostle Paul, and apparently still ongoing today. So then, why would the other 6 days, the days of creation, not also be periods of time much longer than a literal 24-hour day, just like the seventh day, God's day of rest? But certain people may point out that, all throughout Israel's history, the people have understood this to mean a 24-hour day. Even those who hold to the long ages of Genesis 1 acknowledged the days of Exodus 20:8-11 to be 24-hour days. Therefore, young Earth creationists tend to assume from this that the days of creation might also have been 24 hours in length. However, there are others who disagree with that reasoning. Some favor a literary view, a certain kind of purely allegorical view, over a calendar day view, or even a day-age view, where the 7-day pattern is a literary device that serves the explanatory purposes of the author, rather than revealing information about the chronology of natural history, because the account was written at a time when people went by a 7-day week, and so this was allegorically used to explain God's acts of creation to people of that time who were familiar with a system of 6 days of work followed by a Sabbath day, 1 day of rest, each 7-day week. Whereas those with a day-age view use it as an analogy, for chronologically explaining the unfolding of the creative events in question, and yet some even say, depending on the context of which part of the creation account you are looking at, it could be either a literary explanation, or chronological, or both. Some make the blanket statement that an old Earth geology would have to entail macroevolution, which is actually not necessarily true. In fact, many who believe in an old Earth creation neither believe in macroevolution nor theistic evolution, but only divine intelligent design which, without further divine intervention, might only allow for microevolution and ultimately only degenerative natural processes. Curiously, many young Earth creationists also assert that animal death before the fall contradicts what Scripture tells us. They say it conflicts with Bible passages which describe death as a punishment for human sinfulness. But, the curse of Genesis 3 was that Adam and Eve, not the animals, should die for their disobedience, and nowhere does the Bible say that animals were originally meant to live forever, like Adam and Eve were, before the original sin occurred. When studying the natural world, the creation itself seems to tell us that certain animals were designed to prey on other animals. Spiders are specifically designed to catch insects in their webs and eat them. Even some plants are ingeniously designed to prey on insects. Whales eat plankton, and there are many examples in nature where animals produce extraordinary amounts of offspring, vast amounts in some cases, to ensure that a relatively small fraction of them will survive in order to perpetuate the species, thus implying that God may have originally designed a predator-prey food chain ecology for the Earth. It therefore appears like a mistake to project our own human attributes on animals and psychologically anthropomorphize them, and, unlike materialist evolutionism, the biblical perspective is that humans are not just another type of animal, but they are distinct from all other physical life forms because they have a spiritual need, and, as far as we can tell, animals don't possess such a need, nor have such an ability. Some young Earth creationists claim that God quickly redesigned life on Earth after the fall, to behave differently as part of the curse, while others say that the different behaviors are simply the result of corruption entering the creation, and yet others speculate that the creation had such contingencies already designed into it, in advance from the beginning, before sin entered the world, but such ideas are ad hoc, and there doesn't seem to be significant scriptural support for such notions, thus casting much doubt upon them, although the account tells us that God increased the birth pains of humans, and God later put a fear of humans into the majority of animals. According to biblical creationism, and what also seems consistent with scientific principles, the reason for most of the fossils existing today was the Genesis flood, which apparently explains the majority of sedimentary rock formations, formed by water, which of course is where the vast majority of fossils are found, and this explanation reduces the time period in which the soft tissues found in dinosaur bones would have to partially outlast natural decay processes, for us to still find them today. And so biblical creationists, both young Earth and old Earth, can now plausibly claim that a cataclysmic global flood, that happened over 4,350 years ago, explains, better than the secular ideology can, how soft tissues can still be found preserved in dinosaur bones today. The old Earth view, whether secular or biblical, when trying to explain the presence of carbon-14 in fossils and volcanic diamonds, seems less plausible than the young Earth view. However, some suggest that even if the days of creation were longer than literal 24-hour days, they were not necessarily as long as some secular models claim, and so could still agree with, not only, the answers from modern scientific methodology, such as that of the carbon-14 found in fossils and diamonds, but also concur with the biblical explanation that God's day of rest was ongoing at the time of the first-century apostles, so perhaps, by this logic, we can constrain the days of creation to more like thousands of years long, at least for life on Earth. It has to be said that there is a clear distinction between a young Earth view and a young universe view. Some young Earth creationists might not necessarily believe in a literally young planet Earth, nor a young universe, but only that the life on Earth is young, while other young Earth creationists would disagree with that idea. Young universe creationism might suggest that the universe is young and the Earth and life on Earth is young, everything is young, both the universe and the Earth created by God in literally 6 24-hour Earth days. But how old is the universe? Light travels at 186,000 miles per second, and therefore will travel about 6 trillion miles in 1 year, and this distance is called 1 light year. If many galaxies that we can observe through telescopes are billions of light years in distance away from us, then how can the universe only be 6,000 years old like the young Earth creationists claim, when their light has already reached us? Are those galaxies perhaps a lot closer than we think? Are the distance measurements flawed? It seems highly unlikely. Old Earth creationists believe that the universe is billions of years old, which is the simple explanation for how we can observe those distant galaxies, and implies that we are looking at how these galaxies appeared billions of years ago. We are literally observing them in the past. However, no one is able to measure the one-way speed of light. It can only be measured on its return trip, after being reflected back at the observer, so we can only measure the two-way overall speed. For all we know, the speed of light going away from the observer may be half the overall two-way speed, and instantaneous when traveling toward the observer. If that were true, we'd be seeing the entire observable universe as it is right now, not in the past. Nobody has yet come up with an experimental way of testing this question. It seems unknowable. So, are there independent ways that might tell us if the more distant universe is older? Perhaps. For instance, there are no quasars within 500 million light-years of Earth, and this might suggest that quasars were only forming earlier, back then, no later than 500 million years ago. We also have the redshift in the light from galaxies, and the further galaxies are away from us, they tend to be more redshifted, and so regardless of what the one-way speed of light might be, if the currently most agreed upon explanation for redshift is correct, this seems to suggest that the universe is expanding overall, and from the implied expansion we might have a shot at calculating its age. But can we ever really truly know? So if you don't know what to make of it all, you're not the only one. Many who believe in intelligent creation remain agnostic on this point. Like the late Carl Sagan pointed out, it's like we are shining a candle in the dark in a demon-haunted world. Isaac Newton said that what we know is a drop, what we don't know is an ocean. Oh, the despair. But let's allow the term negentropy and see what answers Google's AI can generate for us. I asked Google for a clarification of choice in definitions, negentropy or conservation of energy. Its answer was intriguing. AI overview: negentropy and the conservation of energy are distinct concepts in physics. Negentropy, also known as negative entropy or syntropy, refers to the tendency of systems to become less disordered, while the conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. Here's a more detailed explanation. Negentropy definition: negentropy describes the process of organizing or decreasing the disorder, increasing order, within a system. Relationship to entropy: it's the opposite of entropy, which is a measure of disorder or randomness in a system. In living systems, negentropy is often used to explain how living organisms maintain their complex, ordered structures amidst the natural tendency towards increasing disorder. Example: a messy room becoming clean, ordered, is an example of negentropy, as energy must be applied to organize it. Conservation of energy definition: this principle, often stated as the first law of thermodynamics, states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only converted from one form to another. Example: a light bulb converting electrical energy into light and heat, or a car engine converting chemical energy into kinetic energy, movement. Relationship to negentropy: while negentropy focuses on the organization of energy within a system, the conservation of energy emphasizes the total amount of energy remaining the same, regardless of its form. In essence, negentropy describes the process of creating order within a system, which requires energy input. Conservation of energy describes the total amount of energy within a closed system, which remains constant. While they are distinct concepts, they are related. The creation of order, negentropy, within a system requires a specific input of energy, and that energy must be conserved, meaning it cannot be created or destroyed in the process. Generative AI is experimental. So I asked, does negentropy require an input of information? Google's AI said, yes, negentropy requires an input of information, which is essentially a reduction in entropy, meaning a decrease in disorder or an increase in order within a system. This input of information, or negentropy, is typically linked to correlations within the system, according to the National Institutes of Health, NIH. Here's a more detailed explanation. Entropy and negentropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder or randomness in a system, while negentropy is the opposite, representing a system with a high degree of order or organization. Information as negentropy. In information theory, information is often viewed as a form of negentropy. When information is provided to a system, it can reduce its entropy, leading to a more structured or ordered state. Example, imagine a jumbled deck of cards. If you sort the cards into suits and numbers, you are applying information to reduce the entropy of the deck and increase its order. This sorting process is a form of negentropy. Correlation and order. The information that reduces entropy often comes in the form of correlations or patterns within the system. For example, the arrangement of molecules in a crystal lattice is highly correlated, resulting in a lower entropy state than the disordered state of a liquid. Gibbs' capacity of entropy. Gibbs referred to the contribution to the total entropy due to correlations as the capacity of entropy or negentropy, according to the National Institutes of Health, NIH. Generative AI is experimental. Well, this is interesting, the requirement of information, to bring about this so-called negative entropy. So, not only must there be an input of available energy but, more specifically, there must be an infusion of specified information, to increase the order within any natural system. So all you are in effect doing, is introducing already existing lower entropy into the system from the outside. You've just pushed the origins problem away one step further. You haven't solved it naturalistically at all. You haven't explained how it could ever happen ultimately without an intelligent designer. The origin of the order and information, in ideologically driven exclusively naturalistic terms, remains unsolved. Are we allowed to say, ultimately, that God did it, or are we, in scientific terms, intellectually lazy if doing so? Can there be a God hypothesis within science, even if an operational, experimental, scientific answer might always be impossible? It seems that this very philosophical question, for science, might, forever, remain unresolved. It appears we have arrived at a place where such open questions, for human consciousness, perpetuate. Are we condemned to pen in multiple infinities of time, space, essentially infinite parameter space, into our hypothetical explanations to avoid facing the possibility of miraculous events that seem to go beyond what nature herself can provide? Science is struggling to explain the anthropic fine-tuning in the natural laws of the universe. The laws of physics are such that they allow the existence of human beings to be possible, and some have claimed that all those very precise parameters, happening only by chance, looks impossible. Both the multiverse hypothesis and the God hypothesis, to try and explain anthropic fine-tuning, have the same issue. They are both appealing to infinity, and that makes them scientifically unusable. Either an infinity of differentiated hypothetical universes or an infinite self-existent God have the same philosophical problem. They both are required to be somehow necessarily existing. A supposed multiverse, having an infinite number of different actualities, just pushes the problem away one more step, because you then need to explain a process or mechanism by which those hypothetical universes, all different from each other, were generated, and even when you do that, it then begs the question of how such a generative mechanism originated, and so you haven't really solved it. And of course the same sort of religiosity is obviously also contained within the God hypothesis as an explanation for the anthropic fine-tuning, in, and maybe of, the laws of physics, because how do you explain the existence of a hypothetical God? While that doesn't necessarily prove it wrong, it's just beyond the reach of scientific methodology, it's unobservable, unfalsifiable, and ultimately untestable. As atheist Richard Dawkins contended, God requires an explanation in his own right. So there is just no getting around it. Many of us would want God to exist, because then there would be more meaning and purpose to it all. Wouldn't it be nice to know that, instead of we humans all only being accidentally organized lumps of atoms, there was instead a supreme transcendent Father who created us and loves us? But for science, such ad hominem thinking is perhaps, philosophically, somewhat irrelevant. However, when some atheists claim the fine-tuning argument to be the best argument there is for the existence of an intelligent creator, they are wrong, because even when taking the entropy principle into consideration, with an infinity of universes, it might seem that you would still get very, extremely rare, low entropy universes among them all, somewhere, no matter how exceedingly unlikely they would be. So any hypothesis that relies on infinity is scientifically useless. So, as compelling as the anthropic fine-tuning of the physical cosmos is, contrary to what some materialists might claim, biological evolution is a far better way of investigating the possibility of intelligent design, seemingly more testable than what the fine-tuning argument is, because you are investigating a very real observable parameter space. It's ironic that the very theory that atheists have often used to try and debunk God with, who knows, might actually instead prove an intelligent designer of nature necessary. Here is why. Unlike speculative multiverse arguments, the genetic code in all living things is observable, falsifiable, and therefore most certainly testable on some level, and of course it is within the one universe that we know does exist. There is an actual parameter space from which you have a far better chance of calculating probabilities. The mutation selection mechanism, in biological evolution, is an observably real process from which the viability of natural evolution, as a hypothetical creator of increasing complexity, can, at least in principle, be evaluated, both experimentally and analytically. And, unlike a multiverse, you are not appealing to infinities, but instead practical numbers, that stand a far better chance of, firstly being able to quantify the functional possibility space within, and secondly, being able to make calculations and predictions about the genome. You might have a reasonable shot at quantifying a combinatorial possibility space of a functioning genome in order to calculate the improbability of a genetic accident producing an increase of useful information, as opposed to just producing deleterious junk, information loss, and therefore infer things about genomes in general. When mapping the genome, if the outer limits of a genome's functionality can be scientifically deduced, you therefore have a good chance of studying, and measuring, the rate of accumulating entropy in genomes, and infer what natural evolution is really doing, and ascertain whether it is a creative process or only destructive, and therefore finally be able to separate the known from the unknown in this regard, and then ultimately, after numerous decades, quantitatively being able to make the holy grail of all scientific distinctions possible. Science is advancing toward that total capability very quickly. Even more perplexing are the gene regulatory networks in all biological systems that have so far appeared to be irreducible. Scientists cannot alter them without killing them. From what I have seen, I'm not sure if there are many evolutionists out there who are able to put their cognitive dissonance of this aside and acknowledge that there is a very real problem here with their theory. Is the evidence in favor of an unguided process of creation, or is it a guided process? It seems that the more we uncover, the more the impression of design becomes overwhelming. Obviously I disagree with some of Richard Dawkins' ideas, but I also agree with him on certain things as well. In this instance, instead of engaging in argument by exclusion, he has stated that the question of an intelligent creator is a scientific question, for which, according to him, science may not be able to give an answer. But he still takes the position that there is no God, although proving a negative might be somewhat difficult, perhaps impossible. I assume therefore that this is a polemical position on his part in the interests of scientific rigor, for in practice, proving the non-existence of God seems insurmountable. But when it comes to evolution, his much-touted God substitute, evaluating the hypothesis of naturally occurring increasing organized complexity in biology, it is more testable and falsifiable by experiment and observation, unlike a hypothetical multiverse. In fact, much of it has already been done. For in smaller isolated populations, we observe degeneration and sometimes even extinction, whereas no matter what any population size is, there has never been observed an increase of organized complexity. This very clear observational distinction, which can be made on human timescales, should make a rational scientific investigator pause, and as for an evolutionary scientist, a chill should be running down their spine, if they are being totally honest with themselves.